You have them, surgeons have them, even grocery shoppers and parents use them. They're called mental checklists. And after years of deconstructing genius in my Genius Lab, I've discovered that they are the hidden habit behind mastery that literally nobody's talking about. But the difference between good and consistently great results often comes down to this. In this video, I'll show you how the best in the world, from sommeliers to surgeons, use mental checklists to get genius level results, and how you can too. Welcome to the Everyday Genius Show. I'm Taryn Voget, and if you are new here, hit the subscribe button. On this show, we talk about genius, passion, purpose, and how you can amplify your own gifts. This is the second video in a 5-part mini-series I'm doing on the 5 strategies of genius I've discovered in my Genius Lab. To get an overview of these 5 strategies, check out episode 3 called 5 Strategies of Genius. And this is the second video in the mini-series where we're doing a deep dive into something so powerful and yet so under-discussed, which is mental checklists. So what is a mental checklist? A mental checklist is something that you are probably using a dozen or 24 times every day without even realizing it. And think about leaving the house. Most people have a mental checklist when they leave the house. And it's things like, okay, do I have my phone, my wallet, my purse, my keys, my sunglasses, my water bottle, whatever the things are when you leave the house. Parents have a ton of mental checklists with their kids before they leave for school in the morning. Do you have your homework? Do you have your lunch? Do you have a jacket? Do you have your after-school sports equipment? They run through these checklists. And we all have a ton of these mental checklists that we're using that we don't even think about. But what they allow us to do is get consistently great results. And what I've discovered in my Genius Lab is that the better somebody is, the more high quality their checklist is. And I'll never forget the first time I discovered the power of mental checklists in Genius. I had one of the top wine tasters in the world in my Genius Lab, and he is a master sommelier who teaches people to become master sommeliers. And he is able to deconstruct the structure and quality of a wine in like 2 seconds flat. And we had to slow his process way down, which is what we do in my Genius Lab. And what we discovered is that what he had in his mind, which he didn't even realize he was doing, but after 40 years and tens of thousands of glasses of wine, what he had done was he had created a tasting grid in his mind's eye. And every time he went to taste a wine and analyze it, he would run through this mental checklist tasting grid. And it was, what are the fruits, non-fruits, earth, mineral, oak, acid, alcohol, tannin, finish. And all of those elements he would then kind of fill in his mind's eye to assess the quality and structure of a wine. This happened like this in his mind. He didn't even know he did it. But that is the power of a mental checklist. Now, it took many years and many glasses of wine to know what are the fruits and what are the non-fruits and the earth elements and the oak elements and all that. But that he had this checklist, it allowed him to analyze a wine consistently and accurately at a very high level every time he did it. Another example of a mental checklist is I had a kid whisperer in my Genius Lab. And this is a woman who's worked with over 30,000 kids. And she can stop a kid from having a meltdown or a tantrum in like 2 seconds flat. And I was deconstructing her genius and how she does this. And it just so happened on the way to my Genius Lab, she had stopped at an In-N-Out Burger in California. And there was a 2.5-year-old girl having an ever-loving meltdown. So we used that as the example that we deconstructed because she was able to get this kid to stop a meltdown in 2 seconds flat. Now, what had happened was this kid was having a meltdown. The mom got overwhelmed and left the building and left this little girl with the grandma, which just sent the kid into an even greater emotional spiral. And this kid was screaming and causing just absolute chaos at the In-N-Out Burger. And so Heather, being the kid whisperer that she is, decided to intervene and got this kid to stop her tantrum in like 2 seconds flat. And this kid was, wailing. And I said, well, what did you do? Now, she had a whole strategy for how she'd get on eye level with the kid and kind of get animated. But what her mental checklist was that she would then run through a list of questions that she knew after 30,000 kids would stop a kid from having a tantrum. And on her list were a handful of questions. And some of them were, what are you wanting? What are the big tears for? Or how can I help? And I asked her, I said, well, how do you know that those are the best questions? She's like, oh my gosh, when you've worked with 30,000 kids, you just realize that those are the questions that will actually work to stop a kid from a tantrum and help them move forward out of the tantrum. I thought that was brilliant. Another really cool example of a mental checklist was one of the top copywriters in the world was in my Genius Lab, and he writes copy for big brands like Apple. And I asked him how he knew if his copy was good. And he kind of went like this, and he says, well, I just kind of run through this list. And without knowing that he did this, what he realized was he had a mental checklist for evaluating his copy. And on his checklist was, does it look right? Meaning if it was printed on a page, does it look right? Does it have the right shape? Are the words showing up in the right way? Does it look right? And then does it sound right? If I read it out loud, does it have the right cadence, the right rhythm, the right simplicity of words? Does it sound right? And then does it feel right? Does the person reading it get the right feeling that I want them to have after reading this copy? And then does it have enough of a compelling call to action, and will they take action? And this was an example of his mental checklist. Does it look right, sound right, feel right, and will they take action? And that, again, took years for him to be able to analyze each of those elements, but that checklist made sure that he hit those points every single time. Now, as I'm saying this, you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, well, these are obvious and basic. And yet, I will tell you, not a single one of these people knew that they actually had these checklists, nor did they know they were using them. So that's the power of mental checklists. And another really cool example of one was this guy, Atul Gawande, who wrote a book many years ago called The Checklist Manifesto. And what this guy had discovered was that there was a lot of errors in surgery that caused either massive complications or, in severe cases, death. And what he discovered was that surgical teams weren't all using checklists. And so he worked with the World Health Organization to come up with a 19-point surgical checklist that was broken into 3 categories, which was like pre-surgery, right before you went into surgery, and then right before you left the operating room. I think those were the categories. And there was 19 points in 3 categories for what surgical teams would go through to make sure that everything was right. And just some examples on the checklist were confirm the patient's name and the procedure and which part of the body it was on. Sounds basic, yet there was a ton of accidents where they were performing on the wrong knee or the wrong elbow or the wrong person getting the wrong surgery. Another one was to confirm that there was enough blood supply in the event that the patient needed a transfusion, that there was the right surgical equipment there, and it was the right number of items and in the right sequence that they had. And again, there was 19 points on this checklist, but what they discovered after they implemented this globally through the World Health Organizations and trained these surgical teams was that complications from surgery went down 36%, but even more crazy, deaths went down 47%, almost half as many deaths just by having a 19-point checklist. Now, what had happened was a lot of these surgical teams early on would go through the written checklist, but after enough repetition, it became very quick in their minds and they just kind of run through it. But this is the power of mental checklists where they can literally save lives. So people often think, oh, well, genius is just this thing. Well, genius is the result of a lot going on in someone's mind. And often it comes down to these really high quality checklists that get consistently brilliant results. So what are your mental checklists and how do you get better at them or get more genius results? Well, the first thing to do is to figure out what it is that you're good at or that you want to get better at. Because probably what you already have is a bunch of mental checklists that you're already using, and they might be, in various levels of effectiveness. But let's just take an example of maybe you want to get better at public speaking. So what is the checklist that you have? And there's usually multiple when you are writing a talk. Usually people have a checklist of I want to make sure that the talk is this, 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 and this. And then what's the checklist before you go on a stage to make sure that you're ready? Usually people have a checklist for that. I want to make sure I'm in this posture, looking like this with this kind of energy. And then the checklist for when you're on stage. I want to make sure I'm saying these kinds of things. I'm paying attention to the audience. I'm doing all these mental checklist things. And then after the talk, most people have a mental checklist for when they run through a continuous improvement loop to get better. How did it go? What was good? What could I do better? That kind of a thing. And so even something as, I'd say almost simple as giving a talk or a speech, there's multiple points where people are operating from mental checklists. So what's the thing that you're good at that you want to get better at? It could be baking. It could be art. It could be writing. It could be woodworking. It could be literally anything. But what are your mental checklists? So stop and kind of deconstruct yourself and at certain points ask, okay, well, what are my mental checklists? And then if you want to get better, you can ask yourself, are these the best mental checklists? Or could I upgrade them? And you can often just by bringing some awareness to them, see how you could make them a little bit better. But you can also interview someone who is better than you at the thing that you care about and see what their mental checklists are, especially somebody at a more master level, because their mental checklists are refined and fast. Now, teasing them out of somebody at that level can sometimes take a little bit of effort because they're very subconscious. But if you stop and you get someone actively kind of thinking about it, you will often be able to get their mental checklist and use it. I remember I interviewed a really top salesperson, and he had just a killer mental checklist to know if a sales prospect was worth his time. And I thought, oh my gosh, this would be so helpful for so many people early in their sales career to help them shortcut their learning curve, to just evaluate these, whatever, 5 or 8 things that were on his list and move on or stay with it depending on what the signals were early on. And it was a really brilliant mental checklist. Same was true with an investor that I deconstructed one time. And he was a really successful investor that had a very high hit rate for success on his investments. He was a venture capitalist. And after 50 years of doing venture capital, he had a really great mental checklist to know if a particular investment was going to be good. And I thought, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be great if every junior analyst in his company knew what his checklist was? And so these are just some examples of how you can really deconstruct someone who's at a better level, get their checklist because they've got decades of experience on you, and use that to get better at whatever level you're at. That is the power of mental checklists, and it really does help people get more genius level results. And I hope that helps you take your journey to genius to the next level. As always, thank you for letting me share my greatest passion with you, which is sharing information on genius. I look forward to seeing you on our next episode, which is going to be a deep dive into using multiple senses to get more genius level results. So hit the subscribe button and follow along to get notified of when the next episode drops. And I look forward to continuing our conversation about your genius on the next episode.